you had mentioned how you do some of your own roasting. So, tell us about that, because you've got this big old tank or something out in the back. Well, in the back, in the shop.
Yeah, in the shop. So yeah, that was part of the plan when we bought the business, was to roast our own coffee and then do it in a retail setting, so our guests can kind of see that process unfolding. And when looking at Cedar City, there was only one or two other places that were roasting coffee. None of them were doing it in like a retail format where you could come in and see what that actually looks like. And so we were pretty adamant about doing that and doing it in the cafe, just to bring awareness to that and show that that's a part of our business.
Yeah.
Not that it's just like tucked away in some warehouse somewhere. And, and so roasting coffee is pretty intricate.
Tell about that process. I'm curious about that process.
We have that roaster in the back corner of the building. It was built in 1992. And that machine is designed to roast coffee. And so, what is roasting coffee? So we can go far back. I mean, how far back do you want to go?
I mean, 1992, we're talking ancient.
Yeah.
Now, right?
Ancient now. So. Yeah. And it looks a lot older, which is cool. It's got some patina to it.
Yeah. What do you do? Take me through the process.
I'll give you
of
what we call
fresh coffee.
Seed to cup. So what is coffee and how does it get to a beverage that ends up in a cup that we can consume? So coffee is actually the pit of a tropical fruit. And it grows best along the equatorial band. So all those countries that kind of fall along there are, most of them are renowned for coffee. And so it grows on, it's called a tree, but it looks more like a bush.
Okay.
And it grows these little cherries, roughly the size of a quarter, some bigger, some smaller. And there's a ton of different varieties of coffee. So I kind of, breaking it down, it's like apples. You go to a store, you see 10 different types of apples, especially like in the fall, right? And they all different sizes, different colors, different flavors. And so that's kind of what, on a remedial scale, that's what coffee is. It's this tropical fruit that grows in these areas, all kinds of different varieties, different flavors, different shapes, different sizes. And so what we do with our company, Formation Coffee, is considered specialty coffee. And really all that means is we buy coffee above a certain quality threshold. So when doing like a tasting, we're looking for coffees that are 80 points or above on a structured score sheet. And so really, that scale is supposed to go from 80 to 100. Most of the time we're looking at stuff that's like 85 to 87, 88 points on this score sheet. And like the best coffee you'll find is like 91, 92 points. There's nothing's ever 100. It's
interesting.
Yeah. So that's what we're doing. We're looking for a specific quality standard there. So back to the coffee on the bush. So we have coffee grows in these tropical areas, typically at high elevation. There's things you'll see like shade grown. Yes, that's important, but not the most important. The biggest thing is then harvesting. So like anything that's done to a high degree of quality, it needs to be done by hand. And so
why is that?
So it's, think of, we're talking about a fruit here, right? So you wouldn't go to an apple tree in September and just rip all the apples off. Right. Yeah. And then go and try and make pies with all these different apples, like it's probably not going to be.
You got to sort through them is what you're saying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So like anything, you've got a branch and it's got 60, 80 coffee cherries on it. Well, you're not just going to go and strip them all off. You need to pick the ripe ones at the right time.
Do they actually refer to those as cherries?
Yeah. So it's referred to as a cherry.
Is the fruit edible as well?
Yes, but there's not much fruit. It's really only
it's mostly the
seeds.
The
yeah, exactly. So so we're looking for the ripeness. That's a big thing. And like in some places that grow large amounts of coffee, like Brazil's the largest exporter of coffee in the world, it's a lot more mechanized. And so they do have like coffee harvesters that come and remove all the coffee. But for what we're doing in specialty coffee, you are looking for coffee that is hand picked and then hand sorted. So after the coffee is picked by hand, the proper way to do it is it's picked over a matter of weeks.
Interesting.
By hand. So they are continually out there every day picking the ripe cherries. Through. Yes, because there will be red cherries ripe, and then there will also be green unripe cherries all on the same branch. And so as harvest is going, they're cycling through these fields multiple times, picking the cherries at the correct ripeness. I mean, there are even some places that to ensure that the cherries are getting picked at the proper time, they paint one of the picker's nails the color red that they're looking for. Oh, so really? They know. Yeah. And
interesting.
And this kind of gets into the weeds a little bit, but picking is one of the toughest points, I think, because the labor involved is typically done by women and children, and a lot of the time it's done by migratory pickers. So they actually follow the coffee harvest, like in Central and South America. They are following up and down Central and South America. They are following the harvest to do this job. And so like one thing that we try to look for if we're working very closely with a farmer with like a direct trade type of thing is where they're getting that labor. Because like we don't want to support child labor, right? Like, and we want to make sure that the pickers are getting paid like a fair wage. And so you kind of have to be careful with some of this stuff because we are looking at like global logistics. We are looking in second and third world countries, you know, where people are just doing whatever they can, you know, to make money. And so there is some of this where like, just from an ethical standpoint, like we're not just out buying like the cheapest thing, right? Gotcha. Like we are trying to find something of quality. And then there is like, we like to know that like, yeah, this hasn't been, you know, we're not exploiting people for our gain. Yeah. You know, here in the United States, which is a larger conversation that covers a lot of different industries. So the picking is a really important step in the process, not only from quality, but then just from an ethical standpoint too.
Interesting.
And then, so after the coffee is harvested, it's then processed. And so what you have to do is basically remove the skin of the cherry from the seeds and then ferment that fruit off the seeds. And so,
that's how you peel it off essentially, is you get the skin and then
so they have a machine that removes the skin. It's called a depulper. And then they've got a, like I said, there's fermentation processes to then remove what's called mucilage, or like what the fruit, is from the seeds.
Oh, okay. And
so if you looked at like a cross section of a coffee cherry, you've got the skin and then you've got the mucilage, but it's very, very thin. It's, you know,
and that's why they have to ferment it off because you can't just like pick it off.
Exactly. But it's very, very thin. So like, if you think of like a real cherry, right, it's 75% fruit, 25% pit. This is the opposite.
Interesting.
It's 90% pit and 10, if that. I would say 95.5. Like there's virtually no fruit.
Well, it's like when you eat a cherry or a peach or something, and you're trying to get that last little bit of fruit off of it. You can't because it's so stuck to it. Yes. And so you're trying to get that 10% of that fruit off, which is the difficult part to get off. Interesting.
And so, I mean, we don't need to go deep into the weeds about the fermentation process, but there's a few main ways they do it. One is called naturally processed. And so they don't actually remove the skin, the fruit or anything. They just take the cherries whole off of the tree and they lay them out in the sun to dry.
Oh, wow.
And so it gets to a point where the skin shrivels up and the fruit actually just ferments off that way. And you can pick one of those up and kind of shake it and you can hear the beans rattling around inside this dried husk. The second major way is what's called washed coffee. And so the skin is removed through a machine called a depulper, and then it is left in tanks of water to then ferment, which they monitor the pH of this water. And when it gets to a certain point, they know the fermentation has passed.
Interesting.
And then they remove the coffee from the water and put it in the sun to dry. And then the third major way to ferment the coffee is called honey process. And so it's kind of a mix of the two. So the coffee is depulped like a wash coffee, so it's got no skin on it. But instead of fermenting the rest of the fruit off of the beans or the seeds in water, they then lay that in the sun. So then all that's left is the mucilage, which is the small amount of fruit to then ferment.
Interesting.
Yeah. From there is still like this papery husk on there. In Central and South America, it's called pergamino. Most of the rest of the world calls it parchment. So then they have to run it through a mill that removes the parchment. And then what we are left with is green. It is green. Coffee seed or coffee bean that we can then roast.
So we typically, commercially, we know them as coffee beans, but they're genuinely a seed.
It's genuinely a seed.
So that's what's used to plant to create another one of these trees.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can then we could take some of the green coffee we have and propagate it and grow coffee trees. They probably wouldn't do too well here.
Yeah.
But we could propagate those and
interesting.
Grow
I never
trees.
knew that.
Yeah. So it's the seed of a tropical fruit is legitimately what it is.
Huh. That's, I'm trying to remember. We eat it all the time. It's like rice. It's
farro,
quinoa, is actually a seed.
Yeah.
Right. But people don't really realize that it's actually a seed you're eating, and we refer to it as a grain, but it's actually a seed.
A seed.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Okay, cool.
So once we've got the coffee out of the pergamino or the parchment, then it sits sealed in a warehouse at the country of origin for 2 months. And what they're doing there is monitoring the moisture. So we want the coffee at like 10-11% moisture. So they're letting that after it's sitting in a tank of water, right? It's absorbed moisture. So what they're trying to do is let that moisture kind of stabilize. So it's dried. We want the moisture to stabilize. So it sits in a warehouse essentially, and then put onto a shipping container and shipped here. And then we can get our hands on it and do our thing with it.
So they're green. So do they brown over time because they're just drying out?
So that's all from the roasting process.
Oh, the browning's from the roasting process.
Yeah.
Okay.
So coffee roasting at its most basic form is cooking. We're taking a raw product, and for us to be able to consume it, it has to be cooked.
Okay.
It's just I can't make it any simpler.
So as you roast it, so you get them, they come in these containers, they're green, and now you've got to go through the roasting process. So in your shop, you pull out these green seeds, these coffee beans, and what do you do from there? What's your process to roast it then in-house?
So the roasting process, on its face is very simple. Like I said, we're cooking a raw product.
You just dump them in the bin and...
So essentially, yes.
Okay.
So it can get more intricate than that.
Yeah.
But we are just cooking something in a specialized machine.
You're not sprinkling secret sauces on it or anything. You just dump it in the bin, you cook it, and you get to a certain temperature, or how do you determine when it's ready?
So what we do with specialty coffee, and this is going to very depend on who you talk to, and everybody kind of does things differently. But the idea is we're buying a very high quality product and we want to showcase the quality of that product.
Gotcha.
So our goal when approaching and roasting coffee is how do we highlight the quality of the coffee we've already bought? So people throw words around like terroir, which is like the intrinsic flavors from where it's grown. Like how do we highlight that? Things like that. So we're buying a product that has a ton of inherent flavor. And so our job is to not mask or muddle any of that flavor. We want to show you the purity of the product.
Okay.
Just like if you go, up to Dry Lakes and you buy a ribeye, right? Like you're probably not going to marinate it for 24 hours, right? Do all kinds of crazy stuff to it. Like you're going to come home, you're going to throw that on the grill with some salt and pepper.
Yeah. That medium good the way it is.
Medium rare and just eat it. Right. Yeah. So like ideally, like we're doing something similar. We have a super high quality product. And we just want to showcase the unique and intrinsic flavors that have from growing, the regions, the farming that have developed naturally. We don't want to do anything to mask that. So when we're roasting a coffee, we are figuring out the best way to showcase those flavors. And we're buying the coffees based on those things. Yeah. Like we're not just going like, oh, well, we need a coffee from Brazil. So just send me the cheapest coffee from Brazil because Brazil's a brand that we want to showcase. No, we go, hey, where can we get the best coffee, for our customer base or, however you want to approach that. But, we buy coffee from Ethiopia. I'm looking for a specific flavor profile there. And then I want to roast that coffee to then highlight that flavor profile.
Gotcha. The steak comparison is actually a really good one because, I know a lot of people love their A1's steak sauce and things like that. But I've always said, well, it must not be a very good steak if you have to cover it up. It must not be cooked right if you have to cover it up with the sauces and stuff. And that's a really good comparison. And you're enhancing the natural flavors.
Yeah, we're just trying to do. Yeah, we're just trying to showcase those natural flavors is what we're trying to do. And I explain it to people like there's a quality spectrum there, like anything. Like if we want to talk about like meat, right? Like I can't take ground beef and marinate it and season it and pat it out to look like a steak and grill it and ever have it taste like a steak. Yeah. Right. So if I'm buying low quality coffee, it doesn't matter how good of a roaster I am. It's never going to be as good as that farm fresh. Yeah. Like it's never going to equate to like that farm fresh ribeye. Like if I'm buying something cheap, right. Or I don't have some sort of quality standard. It doesn't matter what I do. It's never going to be as good as buying something with intention and quality in mind.
So tell again, I think you mentioned a minute ago, where do you get the majority of your coffee?
So all over the world. So,
do you have preferences like Brazil or different kind of areas?
I definitely have like my favorites. And again, it's opinion and preferential, right?
Well, shoot it out. What's some of your favorites?
I'm very partial to Colombian coffee and then coffee from Ethiopia. Those are my favorites. But we buy coffee from Central and South America and Ethiopia mainly. And a lot of it has to do like with what we're trying to do from a flavor standpoint in the cafe. So that kind of dictates how we purchase the coffee. So it's with there not being much specialty coffee here and specialty coffee knowledge here, we aren't trying to do anything that's
too crazy or
exactly. Like we could easily be buying coffees that are $30 or $40 a pound unroasted and trying to sell those, but who's going to buy those? Yeah. Like you're trying to provide quality. How do we justify to somebody like you should be buying this coffee instead of something that's, $5 a pound our cost.
So those who have a familiar coffee palate, why do you have your personal preference to Colombia and Ethiopia? What is it about the is it the aroma? Is it the taste, the palate? What? So
all of that.
Are there specific like hints? Like when I hear people like talk about, this has a little nutmeg in it.
From like a very macro view. Yeah. Ethiopia is considered the birthplace of coffee. It's actually Yemen, but Africa is considered the birthplace of coffee. Interesting. It's one of the only places coffee actually grows wild. Oh wow. and because it's so tropical, very mountainous, the coffees are just of very high quality. And they are some of the most unique coffees in the world from a flavor standpoint. So lots of fruit characteristics, lots of acidity. They're very dynamic and complex.
I actually wondered about that part of the world because we always think of South America, right?
Yeah.
For coffee. And I was wondering about that as you were describing things, but well, what about that side of the world? And so that's interesting to hear that that's considered like the birthplace of coffee.
And then Colombia is really cool because it's got so many diverse microclimates that they basically are harvesting coffee year round. It's the only country in the coffee growing world
that can go year round,
that they're harvesting different parts of Colombia year round. And some farms actually, in some regions, actually have 2 harvests a year.
Interesting.
Yes. So it's really unique. There's always fresh coffee coming from Colombia, which is really cool. And then because it's so diverse, there's just like so many diverse flavor profiles that you can get out of Colombia. And the cool part about Colombia and a lot of these coffee growing countries, because it's such a large portion of their economy, they spend a lot of money developing the coffee, and Colombia has really done a great job with that, just educating farmers, producers, the whole spectrum of people involved in the industry. And so the coffee is just very high quality.